Hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to this wonderful event. And thank you for coming to this wonderful event that includes on this particular Professor Krishna, who used to be the head of the school in Rajghat in Varanasi, and was appointed by Krishna Moody himself to that particular role. Now he continues as the head of the, what is it?
Study center.
The study center, sorry, the study center. And he's here with this lady to partake in our celebration, our 50th celebration. He also authored a very intriguing book called A Jewel on a Silver Platter, in which he accounts his encounters with Krishnamurti and has many different conversations with members of the Theosophical Society and the Indian Foundation and others about Krishnamurti. So it's a very worthwhile book to read. And by the same token, Dr. David Moody, he started out in 1975, so he's definitely an old-timer. You know, you might call him an old-timer. I often refer to myself as an old-timer, but on this particular occasion, there are several old-timers here, because I see Mark Lee and Asha, who also are old-timers at the school. David Moody was the first teacher at the Oak Grove School in 1975, then a bit later left to earn his PhD in education and returned, and for a while was the co-director, and then for a while he was the sole director, both of the sole and the only director. And he was also particularly close to David Bohm, whom you may have heard of, who was a close personal friend of Krishnamurti's, and with whom Krishnamurti had many dialogues. And also with David Moody, Krishnamurti had many dialogues with him. So, and the same was true with Professor Krishna. Now, David Moody wrote several books. The most remarkable and maybe worthwhile is called An Uncommon Collaboration, in which he very, very poignantly and brilliantly explains the interaction between Krishnamurti and David Bohm that lasted, after all, 25 years, pretty much. So it's highly recommended to put it on your list, reading list, if you haven't done so already. Good, that's all I can say. And so let us proceed to the next stage. And thank you again for coming.
You want to test the mic? It's okay.
Thank you, sir. Are we all set? Looks good? Okay. So then, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. And this afternoon, Dr. Krishna and I are going to discuss a couple of different topics. We've done this before 3 or 4 times, and we have kind of a format where he allows me to kind of introduce the general framework or orientation for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I will pose a question for him to address, and then we'll turn that into a dialogue for, as I say, 2 different topics today. And one of the reasons I like to engage in this kind of conversation with Dr. Krishna has to do not just with the particular topics that we discuss, but also my feeling or attitude toward the teachings of Krishnamurti in general. I may be mistaken, but I have the impression that the teachings have not really been fully understood by very many people, even though a lot of people have studied the teachings rather carefully. And I certainly put myself in that category of someone who has studied carefully but not fully understood. And one of the reasons this is of concern to me is because I've noticed that in the years since Krishnamurti has died, we have had quite a few, conferences and gatherings and people speaking. And generally, it seems to me when people talk about issues related to Krishnamurti, they try to explain or explore, what they know, what they understand, what they have understood of the teachings. But since the teachings are not fully understood, it seems to me like it might be a little bit more honest or effective, shall we say, if at least once in a while we begin with what we don't understand, what we find confusing or illogical or just strange in the teachings. And my conversations with Dr. Krishna are rewarding to me because he allows me to articulate these points in the teachings which I find strange or confusing, and then he and I engage in a dialogue to explore those points. So today we're going to pick up a couple of topics, and one of them has to do with what is called freedom from the known. And just recently there was a conference held addressing that topic, and I went to hear the main speaker, a very highly regarded professor of philosophy and the neurophysiology of perception. And I listened to him for 2 or 3 hours, and I heard almost nothing whatsoever about freedom from the known. He might have touched on it tangentially. So it seems to me like this is a fertile topic for further exploration. Krishnamurti wrote a book also called Freedom from the Known, and this is a topic which has come up many times in his talks throughout his lifetime. And if you just kind of step back for a minute, at first glance, the whole idea of freedom from the known, it sounds a little bit crazy, actually. Nobody would ever say that they want to have, freedom from beauty or freedom from sunlight or freedom from oxygen or freedom from love. And so why would you want to have freedom from the known? The known knowledge seems like our friend, something which is very worthwhile to have. We couldn't talk to one another without knowledge. I couldn't get home or use a computer or do much of anything. So what sense does it make to talk about freedom from the known? And, it may be that this phrase, this idea, is a little bit like another one of Krishnamurti's ideas, which is the ending of time. And there's another, as you may know, there's another Krishnamurti book called Ending of Time, which consists of dialogues that he conducted with Professor Bohm. And I personally feel like that title of that book is a little bit unfortunate. It seems to me somewhat misleading, because if you haven't already read the book or been exposed to Krishnamurti's teachings, and you hear a title like Ending of Time, you couldn't possibly think that that means anything other than, ending of the clocks and ending of calendars and ending of ordinary chronological time. It would be perfectly natural to think that's what that refers to. But then if you read the book and see what the Bohm and Krishnamurti are talking about, you find out, well, it has to do with something entirely different. It has ending of time for them means nothing whatsoever like ending chronological time. And so maybe freedom from the known is a little bit like that. It may be, therefore, that freedom from the known doesn't just have to do with putting aside knowledge in general. It may be kind of like ending of time, a much more specific, focused kind of thing, where you're just talking about knowledge in a psychological space, not the knowledge that we need to talk to one another or drive or use a computer. But even if you limit your attention to things happening in the psychological sphere, it's very hard to know at first glance what it could mean to be free from that kind of knowledge, Because even in the psychological space, I have to know, who my friends are and who I have to look out for and be careful of. And I have to remember interactions I've had with people in the past. And the idea of just, being free from all that, putting it aside, takes a little getting used to, and it makes you really wonder, what is this all about? Can we get clear what the meaning of this is? And so before I turn it over to Dr. Krishna, I'd just kind of like to sum it up a little bit more briefly. I was telling a friend of mine yesterday about this conversation I was going to have today on the subject of freedom from the known, and she said, well, what is that? She said, wouldn't it be much better? I'd like to know if we could have, freedom from the unknown. And I thought, quite right, that certainly that, if we're to be honest about it, if you had to ask yourself, which would you rather have, freedom from the known or freedom from the unknown, I think freedom from the unknown might, at least at first glance, be a little bit more appealing. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Krishna and see if we can begin to dive into this rather seemingly strange topic, freedom of the known. What can that possibly mean, and why would Krishnamurti not only recommend it, but advocate it with great force and passion, as if it's a very, very important part of our lives?
First of all, I think it's important to realize that Krishnaji is talking in the psychological field, not in the factual field. He has clarified that we need factual knowledge, and that does not prevent us from observing things as they are. But in the psychological field, all our likes and dislikes and prejudices and identifications prevent us from seeing things the way they are. And also, they prevent us from coming afresh to experiences or relationships, because we carry this whole baggage of images formed from previous reactions. And those color our perceptions and in a way make us react rather routinely, like a computer reacts rather routinely, and that it therefore blocks creativity. And that is the known from which one needs to be free in order to be creative, both in relationships and in understanding oneself and so on. Otherwise, the mind tends to repeat only and defend its prejudices and justify them and so on. So that's the danger which he is pointing out. So the objection is really to psychological memory, not factual memory as the knowledge. That doesn't create, you use your factual knowledge, and once you have used it, it stops interfering. It's just kept as a tool which to be used when necessary. But psychological reaction comes up irrespective all the time. To give an example, I would say the Hindu is brought up to think that the cow is a sacred animal. And so when he looks at a cow, he feels that there is a goddess there. And the American looking at the cow thinks it's a piece of beef which could be cooked tomorrow and eaten. So the reactions of the two people are very different. to the same site. And when they are attached to their view, then it creates problems, because if one man is killing the cow for making beef, the other man is getting angry and upset and fights with this man. And this is a everyday occurrence. In India, we see this quite often, that Muslims are trying to kill the cow, and both for food and for leather and so on. And the Hindus object to that. And that comes from this background of, it's not based on just kindness or compassion, because they don't object to a horse being killed or a goat being killed. They object only to the cow being killed. So that kind of identification or attachment to certain views which you have imbibed right from childhood, it is that which creates this psychological barrier. And you need to examine that and free yourself of it in order to see things in the true perspective. That's how I understand what he's saying.
So then that raises a couple of questions. One would be freedom. There's a how question involved in this, because even in the area of practical knowledge, suppose that I happen to know how to speak French. If you ask me to forget how I know how to speak French, I couldn't forget it. It's there. It's embedded in the brain cells. And similarly, in a psychological field, if somebody has done some disservice to me, or made me angry, insulted me, it may be kind of advantageous in some way, or might free me up if I could put that aside and forget about it, but I can't. The memory of that event is there. It's in the brain cells. I can't just wish it away or will it away. So how does one come upon this freedom from the past, freedom even in the psychological sphere?
First of all, I think we should be clear that freedom from something does not mean the ending of that thing. Because if you don't have a wife, where is the need to free yourself of your wife? Right? And similarly, the knowledge is sitting there, it's in your brain, and there is no way you can wipe that off. It's not like a blackboard with a duster which you can wipe off your memories. And that wouldn't be desirable either, because if you lost all your memories, you would have amnesia, which is certainly not the intention. So therefore, one has to examine what produces problems in life, what produces division between people, what produces disorder in consciousness. That means all kinds of negative emotions that we are prone to. And you need to free yourself of that. And you can do that because if you examine it in your own life as you live in daily existence, you will find that the cause is often illusory. It is something that you have accepted to be true when it's not part of nature. It is simply a thought construct which you have accepted because right from childhood you have accepted it and you have not examined it or questioned it. And those kind of illusions, they produce these negative emotions in you. And therefore it's necessary to examine and get rid of those which are illusory. You can't get rid of those which are biological, real. For instance, you fall down and you have a pain in your leg, that's biological. You can't get rid of it. But the self-pity that comes out of it is not biological, it's psychological. And it's a certain way of thinking about yourself in relation to that pain, and so on. So it is when you discover that your own thinking is causing the problem, and you see the danger of it, it will stop. Because nature has put an intelligence into us which prevents us from courting danger. But it is because we don't see the danger of it that we fall into the temptation of these psychological images and illusions.
So that's great. That clarifies a lot. Let's try to kind of fine tune that and bring it into focus a little bit more.
Sure.
Because you mentioned self-pity. If I happen to injure myself, that would be a good example. But let's take something else and look at it in the same light. Somebody has said something to me yesterday in the midst of a group of people, which I found really somewhat insulting and humiliating. And I think what they said was false, but they put me in a very negative light, and that's going to hurt my reputation. It's going to have negative factual consequences in my life. Plus, I don't like it. I don't like someone saying something about me which was mean and false. And so that arouses a feeling of antagonism in me and anger. And you're telling me, what are you telling me? That I need to look at that and think that maybe there's some illusion in that, and if I see the illusion, then it will magically drop away. Where is the illusion in that? These are facts. It took place. Suppose.
Yes. One has to ask oneself this question, that after all, that person didn't actually hit you. So it's not some kind of a physical pain that you are experiencing. So what is this pain which we call hurt? It is a process within oneself that produces that feeling of pain, and that's why it is psychological. The hurt is psychological. We have not been taught to examine that. Now, there is obviously an external cause that somebody talked to you rudely or insultingly. But there is also an inner causation within oneself which produces this feeling of hurt, and then from the hurt, a feeling of revenge or retribution and so on. And the memory of that distorts your relationship for a long time. There is a lot of instance, if you study history, how a war began or a big fight between two people began, that it began with a simple hurt or a difference of opinion, and then each side attacks the other, and then the other person feels hurt for the same reason you felt hurt, and therefore he becomes aggressive too, and it mounts, and it becomes like warlike situation. So when you see all that, the question comes, why do I feel hurt? And you rightly mentioned that we are bothered about our reputation. Now, when somebody criticizes you, you see that as an attack on that reputation, which is an image, like that. But you have to go deeper and you have to ask yourself, why do I have this self-image, which then I need to protect? Can I not see the comment made by my friend or somebody in the audience as an input of information, that that's what that person thinks about me or about the situation or about my view? And there may be something that is true in it, then attend to that and correct it. If it is false, can you not just drop it away and leave it because it's something false? So in other words, there are two possible ways in which we respond to a statement. Either we react to the statement, which means all this known, the psychological known, judges and reacts. Or we approach it with a learning mind. Now, if I might illustrate that with an example, I've been a professor of physics, and I work hard at my lessons to teach my students. Supposing one of my students goes out and says, Professor Krishna is a lousy professor, I don't understand a thing in his class. And this is, no, I'm saying supposing.
I know.
And this is conveyed to me by another student who says that he was bad-mouthing you and saying this. Now, there are two ways in which you can react. If you have a reacting mind, you say to yourself, what, I take so much trouble, I teach those students, that fellow doesn't pay attention in the class and therefore does not follow what I am doing, and he goes out and badmouths me to other students. Let him come tomorrow, I'll see to it, how dare he speak like that, and so on. That is a reactive mind. But if I don't have a reactive mind, I take it as an input of information that there is a student of mine who's not following my lectures. And after all, as a teacher, it's my responsibility to communicate the subject matter to the students. So then I ask myself, is he the only one, or are there more such students in the class? So I go and ask next day, all the students, did you follow what I taught last time? And I find that only a few did and the others didn't. So then I have to find out whether I am assuming much more knowledge on their part than what they have. Or I'm talking at a level which is quite different from their level at which their knowledge is stuck. So I can use it as a tool for learning and improving my own teaching. Or I can react and get angry with the person who badmouths me because it's going to affect my reputation and so on. So when you have this, if you see this very clearly, then you realize that criticism is not something to feel angry about or react, but something to consider that there is another person who has pointed out something about you which may not be favorable to you, but it may be true. And so you need to examine that, whether it is true or not. And where is this hurt coming from, like that? So one can learn to approach the criticism differently, then the hurt goes away. So in a way, that's my contribution to the hurt. His contribution, the external contribution, has been that he has talked rudely or insultingly towards me. That's also there. Normally, we have been trained to handle the external cause and not the inner cause. We are often unaware of the inner causation within us. But what Krishnamurti is suggesting is that self-knowledge is about learning about oneself. And when your focus is on learning about yourself, then you approach it with a learning mind, because your own learning is important, more important than your reacting to the statement. That's how I understand it.
So yes, I'm going to, I want to move on to our second topic because it's kind of indirectly related to this, but before I do, I want to just, as I say, kind of try to fine-tune this just a little bit further, if I may. I don't want to, beat a dead horse, but let me just put it slightly differently again. So the person, has insulted me, and I've looked at, the fact that, okay, well, he hasn't really damaged my reputation. He hasn't hit me. There's nothing really objective in the outer world that any negative consequences that are going to come from this. But my bad feeling still doesn't go away because as you pointed out, what he's done is he has said something to me about myself that is very derogatory and negative. And, you asked me to sort of look at that and kind of evaluate it and see, well, is it true or is it not true? And, I can kind of do that. But, suppose I decide, yeah, there's a little germ of truth in there. Or the other way, it's not true. Why would someone say something like that to me, which is not true? Even if I put aside all of the extraneous things and really focus on that area that you've asked me to attend to, okay, yes, he's hurt my image. Just because I see he's hurt my image, the whole thing doesn't go away. It doesn't dissipate just by virtue of that. It's still there. It's alive. And where can we fine-tune? Where's the illusion in that? Where is the opportunity to let all of that fade away? Because I'm not going to forget, what he said about me casually. It's there in the brain cells.
The illusion is the unawareness of the inner cause. You are aware of the external cause, that he was rude and he misbehaved. But that within you, therefore, has welled up a certain anger against him, and that has an inner cause. And if you don't learn and free yourself of that inner cause, it will recur again. You may deal with that particular instance of somebody criticizing you or bad-mouthing you, and you may succeed in threatening him next day so that he doesn't speak like that anymore. But there are many other people who will come and speak insultingly to you. So you are not freed yourself from the problem of, So it's to realize that there is a inner disease which is more important to learn about and free oneself of, so that one is not so vulnerable to other people's opinion about it. I recently read an instance from Obama's life, which has a bearing here, though it's a much stronger instance. When he was president of South Africa, he became president of South Africa, he took his guards and so on and went to a restaurant.
Krishna Mandela.
What did I say?
Obama.
Obama, yeah. Mandela, sorry. In South Africa, yeah. So, thank you for that correction. He went to a restaurant with his guards to give them a treat, and he saw a man sitting at the restaurant alone at another table waiting for his order. And he told his guards, call him and let him sit by my side. So these guards went and invited that man to come and sit next to Mandela. Mandela, I'm getting old.
No, it's the fact that you're worried about your wife.
No,
Yeah.
okay. Anyway, so that man came, sat next to him, but all through the meal, his hands were trembling. So the guards asked him afterwards, why was that man trembling sitting next to you? And he said, he was the guard of my prison. And after they used to torture me, I would scream for him to give me some water. And he would come and urinate on my head. Yeah. So he was scared that I would treat him the same way, now that I am the president. But that's not my ethics and it's not my character. Therefore, he didn't know that. So it's same as Jesus saying, God forgive them for they know not what they do. Yeah. So why are we so reactive when somebody ill-treats you? And instead of seeing that he has a problem that he needs to solve, and you are taking revenge on him, only increases his problem. So if you see it in that way with some compassion, then you don't react that way. Another instance from the life of Krishnamurti himself. In 1977, I went to him in England and met him at Brockwood. And he said, "Sir, the other day a man came here, looked at the tent where I give the talks, came and had lunch with us in the dining hall. He saw the school, and he came to see me afterwards. And he said, 'You have a nice thing set up here, haven't you?' So I felt a little bad that somebody should suspect his motives in doing all this. And so I said, 'Oh, sir, there are always people like that. Who cares?' And he held my hand and he said, 'No, don't brush him aside.' I watched myself for a whole week before saying to myself, 'It's not true.'
Yeah.
That's all. So you can look at criticism in that way as an opportunity to learn about yourself. Or you can react and get angry about the person who has criticized you.
Good, thank you. That story about Mandela is very, very powerful. Thank you. So I'd like to then introduce our second topic for today, which actually is interwoven to some extent with the first one. So some of you may know that Krishnamurti said, I think on several occasions, he made the rather remarkable statement. He said, "Time is the enemy of man. Time is the enemy of man. Meet it and go beyond it." And this statement came up among other places in those dialogues that I mentioned previously, that were published in the book called The Ending of Time. And it's important. Time is the enemy of man. Krishnamurti was not referring to time by the clock or time by the calendar, what we call chronological time. He was talking about something else quite different. And this statement came up in connection with a question that Krishnamurti had posed to initiate the whole series of dialogues with Dr. Bohm. Krishnamurti had said, "Has humanity taken a wrong turn?" He was referring to the whole course of the evolution of the human being over many, many thousands of years. He says, has mankind taken a wrong turn? And they discussed it, and Krishnamurti said, yes, there is a wrong turn, and the nature of the wrong turn was that at some point human beings began to think in terms of the process of what he called becoming. And by that he meant a process of psychologically becoming someone better, becoming someone wiser or more virtuous. He summed that up with that word of becoming, meaning a process of becoming a different kind of person as a process of improvement through time. And he said that there's something very false and illusory about that problem, and it's not just a minor incidental thing. It's a very, very fundamental feature now of human consciousness. And he felt like that process of psychological becoming is so potentially dangerous that it caused him to say time in that sense, time is the enemy of man. So for our second topic with Dr. Krishna, I'd like to explore this notion of psychological time. What is that? And is it really something all that different from chronological time? And why is this process of becoming so fraught, so potentially dysfunctional or dangerous? And we could take an example. Suppose that for someone, the process of becoming, in the case of a certain person, might be, as a young person, I want to grow up and become a doctor. And if I want to become a doctor, I have to go to college and I have to go to medical school, and then I have to have a period of time as a resident before I become a fully fledged doctor. And that's a process of that occurs through chronological time. It's not just a psychological thing. I'm becoming a doctor, and becoming a doctor is not just a practical, technological thing. Part of the reason I want to become a doctor is because I want that prestige. I want that social position and the reputation and all the psychological rewards of having people look up to me and admire me. And so that's a process of becoming, which is going to occur through time. It's chronological time. So on what basis would we, make the charge that, oh, this is really some other kind of time, which I'm calling psychological time, and consider dangerous or false for some reason? Or you could even take a much simpler example of, suppose I was in a situation that caused me to get angry and want to say something negative or have an emotional reaction to somebody. But before I do that, I might catch myself and say, oh, I better settle down because I've been angry before, and I know that if I just settle down and let it be for a day or 2 days or 3 days, very often my anger just kind of dissipates, and a couple days from now, I'm really not so angry anymore. I've had that experience, and I know that if I just wait, and that's a waiting through chronological time. It's not psychological. It's a chronological time, but it allows me to go through a kind of process of becoming more relaxed, becoming more reasonable. And what's wrong with it? Why is Krishnamurti focusing on this thing he calls becoming and saying it's so dangerous, when I can think of these examples where it seems like a perfectly reasonable and logical thing to do, and where it's not that clear? What is the difference between this mysterious psychological time and chronological time? Are they really so different? And why is one just a fact of daily life and the other some terribly difficult or dangerous thing to look out for?
I think the wrong turn that Krishnamurti and David Bohm were talking about in Ending of Time is that in the process of evolution, nature gifted us with an additional capacity for memory and imagination, the capacity to learn language, and therefore communicate much more than what animals can. And all these faculties were necessary for survival. So none of them is unnecessary. But nature has not dictated how we should use these faculties. In the case of animals, nature has dictated. There is a certain amount of violence, but that violence is also limited by nature. A tiger will eat a goat, kill and eat a goat, because that's food for the tiger, as prescribed by nature. But he will not fight and eliminate all goats and create enmity against the whole species like that. They are not capable of it. But human beings have done that, and we are capable of it because we have this freedom to enhance the biological violence which is there in us, or to decimate it. I mean, you can either become a Hitler or you can try to be Gandhi or Krishnamurti. So human beings have this freedom. So in a sense, as I interpret that statement of wrong use of those faculties, it is in forming what we call the ego. And then the ego is the main source of all disorder in our consciousness, in our relationships. it's the cause of fear, it's the cause of worry, anxiety, conflict within ourselves, judgment, and all that. And as was pointed out by Michael Mendiza in the talk this morning, that is just a construct, and it is not a factual thing. It's not like your heart or kidney or stomach and like an organ in the body. The ego is just created by the manner in which we approach life or we respond. Now, if we realize the danger of using imagination and so on in that way, then one would not use it to constitute the ego. But once the ego has been formed, it hijacks our capacities of thought to make the mind function like your own personal lawyer, all the time defending the me and the mind, justifying the me and the mind, and looking for the profit and the security of the me and the mind. And that's a turnaround, that one is then not interested in the truth, one is interested in profit. And if you free yourself of that, which is what Krishnaji calls love, he says love is where the self is not, means the ego is not. That means you are no longer approaching it with that profit motive. You do it for the love of it, or in your own example of doing the medical studies and trying to get a degree, you could be doing that out of the motive of helping people solve their health problems or treating people who are suffering, physical suffering. Or you could be doing in order to build your own reputation in society and prestige and power, right? Then the medical knowledge becomes a means to an end, and the ends are used to justify the means, like that. But you could also be a doctor because you wanted to serve humanity, and you are legitimately working hard because you want to be a good doctor. You can demand excellence of yourself, and that is part of Krishnamurti's teaching, that we must demand excellence of ourselves in everything that we do, not only in that where our ambition lies. So you can do things efficiently, you can do things, work hard at something, not with the intention of using that to achieve some name, fame, power, position, and so on. Then it ceases to be self-centered activity. And therefore, the ego is not activated, is not functioning in that way. So the ego comes in the manner in which we approach things in life. The same thing can be done egoistically, and the same work can be done non-egoistically. And if you do it non-egoistically, there is not all that negative emotion and violence and conflict arising out of it. There is only joy in doing things. And if you do it egoistically, then it has all those consequences that come in it. So one has to learn what is the right use of these faculties and what is, in a way, wrong use of these faculties. Not right and wrong in the sense of some moral edict, but right as that which is health leads to health, happiness, peace, and wrong as that which leads to conflict and fights and unhappiness for human beings, for people in society. So that's how I see that the wrong turn is when man started using these faculties for psychological security, psychological overcoming of loneliness and things like that, fears. Whereas the legitimate use, of course, of imagination is when you want to plan your travels or you want to plan a surgery and so on, that you need imagination. You need imagination to study science, and you need logic and thought. So it's not as if this thing is bad, this thing is good. That's too simplistic. What is the right place of everything? And that's, Krishnamurti laid stress on that you must discover for yourself the right place of everything in life, right place of knowledge, right place of thought, right place of sex, right place of money. So it's not a question that one should have this or not have this. That's too simplistic formula for life. And this is self-knowledge, to know exactly what is the right place of everything and put it in its right place, then it does not cause any negative emotions or disturbance in that. So in other words, we are ourselves responsible for constituting the ego, which doesn't actually have existence in nature, by the manner in which we are approaching life. And if we can learn about that, not by saying Krishnamurti has said you should not have an ego, but by staying with the ego, watching what it does in your life, to your relationships, to your sleep, to your health, everything. And then in that watching in daily life, you will discover the danger of it. Of course, it also brings certain amount of pleasure, it brings certain amount of profit, and so on, to be ambitious, to be greedy and all that. But if you watch long enough, you will see that that is one single cause of almost all unhappiness in yourself and therefore also in society. So when you perceive that danger, why would you approach life that way? So he's not saying it as a moral injunction, not that you should not be egoistic, you will not be able to take that decision. But when you see the danger, it doesn't need decision. It doesn't need decision not to play with fire. The danger is so clear. So here the danger is not clear because we haven't stayed with that question long enough to watch and so on. So he's saying when you have the perception of the danger, it will stop on its own. So it's the perception is the action, not your decision is not the action. That's how I understand it anyway.
Yeah, that last point is very good. It's the perception, which is the action, and which brings about the change, not my will or my intention to.
Yeah.
But there's still a couple of points here that I'd like to see if we can clarify, because
Sure.
I can follow along at the way that you've described it, but I want to bring into the foreground a little bit, if I may, this question of what does Krishnamurti mean by psychological time, and why does he even use that concept and make such a sharp distinction between that and chronological time? And part of the reason why this is confusing is because if you say something like, psychological time has to do with some kind of psychological improvement through time, it's not clear really in actuality in daily life why that should be distinguished so sharply from chronological time the way Krishnamurti seems to do. Because to go back to my example of I want to become a doctor, my wanting to become a doctor is not so simple. Part of it is this kind of objective thing that you described where, I'm interested in medicine, I want to help people. But it's not only that, it's also that I also want the social status and the prestige and these, psychological payoffs, and they get mixed up together. And so and when you have that combination of elements, and then you have Krishnamurti saying that there's chronological time on one hand, which is a fact, and which is it's an irrevocable part of daily life, and there's nothing wrong with it. And then he says, but there's also this other thing called psychological time, which he says it doesn't exist. It's just an illusion. But in daily life, they don't seem to be distinct like that at all. They seem to be entirely interwoven, and it's very, very hard to tell where one leaves off and the other begins. So it creates a point of confusion in the teachings of Krishnamurti, why he makes this very sharp categorical distinction between those two and says, well, chronological time is factual, psychological time is illusory, and, by God, you better figure out the difference and see the illusory nature of psychological time. Otherwise, you're finished. Your life is going to be a mess.
Well, chronological time is independent of my motives and so on. It has to do with the rotation of the earth around the sun, and that goes on whether you achieve something or don't achieve something. So it's completely independent, whereas psychological time is created by the motive with which I function. I do a particular activity. Let me take a rather simple example to illustrate that. We are capable of doing things non-egotistically. Usually that's not in your profession, but in your hobbies. You do something just for the pleasure of doing it, or the joy of playing tennis or something like that, and you're not deriving your reputation out of it or prestige and so on. So we have that capacity of doing something just for the fun or just for the joy of it. And if you play a game that way with your friend, just for the joy of playing, then no negative emotions come in that. But if you give tremendous importance to winning the game, there is also the pleasure of winning the game, being victorious. Then, if you lose, you feel frustration. If you win, you feel proud. If the opponent falls down, you feel happy that you will now win the game. You feel like cheating when the umpire is not looking. So all those negative emotions come in because one is approaching the game with a view to winning strongly. And then it becomes egoistic because the result is more important than the process or doing. So now, if you can play a game non-egoistically, then no negative emotions come into it. And if you play it egoistically, giving importance to the result, then all the negative emotions come into it. Then isn't life, whole of life is also like a game. It can be played non-egoistically or it can be played egoistically. So the motive with which one is functioning, that is what is making it psychological. So when the ego gets associated with it, I am looking at it as some profit, some reputation, some Nobel Prize I will receive and all that, right? Yeah. Then there is this motive of profit. Otherwise, it's in all activities in life, there is the joy of engaging in that activity. You can learn music, you can relate with nature just out of, you can be friends with people just out of the joy of friendship, of sharing things. But if you're all the time seeking something for yourself, you bring in the ego into that relationship. And the ego will have its downsides. So it's not that you should not build a good hospital or be a good doctor, but if you do it ambitiously, you will bring into that activity all the consequences of ambition. So if something comes in your way, you're going to brush him aside, and so the violence is born out of that approach. And your mind is then, your time is being used to achieve that end, and therefore all the time the concept of waste of time arises, that if I am doing something which is not taking me in that direction, then I'm wasting my time. And children are being educated that way. They are being told, don't play, don't waste your time, study, and for the exam and so on. So we promote this ambition, and later on you find that that person doesn't pay attention to his friends and so on. He's all the time self-centered, and then we object that he's like that. We don't see the connection between the two, that when you do something ambitiously, it will have those consequences. The same thing can be done non-ambitiously, in which case it doesn't have those negative consequences. That's how I feel that he says that psychological time is the enemy of man. That means the ego is the enemy of man, because psychological time is the ego. There is in fact a statement of his where he says, time is ego. And then David Bohm asks him, is all time ego? And Krishnaji looks at his statement and says, no, not all time is not ego. Yeah, but psychological time is ego. Yeah.
So, psychological time, as I hear your description, it sounds, I can follow it, it sounds right and accurate, but there's a point that is still a little bit elusive for me, because it sounds as though the trouble with psychological time is that if I go down that path, there are going to be negative consequences that I did not anticipate. And I can see that point. I understand that. But the way Krishnamurti expresses it, he puts a little bit different twist on it, because if I understand what he said, he goes beyond that. He says that psychological time per se is illusory. He says psychological time doesn't exist, and part of the illusion is not merely that if I go down that path, I'm going to encounter negative consequences that I didn't anticipate, but there's something deeper involved, that there's something intrinsically false about the path per se, because he says there is no such thing as psychological time. And the beginning of the difficulty is that we imagine that there's some realm of that kind in which we can function, but the realm per se doesn't exist. It's not merely that it leads to negative consequences. And can you help us elucidate why that would be the case?
Yeah, illusion means it is not something part of nature. It is coming out as a construct of one's own thinking or approach. And therefore, if you don't approach it that way, it's not there. So the motive, one of his statements is that the approach to a question is more important than either the question or the answer. Yeah, that means if you're going to approach something egoistically, then that will determine what answer you will receive out of it. And so the approach to something is far more important than the result or the question. In the morning talk, Michael Mendiza also mentioned that inquiry, if it is purely intellectual, is just a thought construct which is being analyzed logically and so on. But this inquiry into self-knowledge is a more holistic inquiry that takes intellect and emotions and awareness all holistically. All your faculties, including the body, are involved in, so there is a sense of wonder. There is a spirit of inquiry. Without that spirit of inquiry, it becomes dry and just philosophic. It is not actual. So, something that is constructed by my own mind, I decide to approach it that way. I have that motive. Nature doesn't have that motive. Therefore, it's illusory. That's how the use of the word illusion, I understand that. It's not really part of nature. But for example, sexuality is not illusory, but lust is illusory, because sexuality is part of nature. It's there in the animals, it's there in the plants. But with the human being, this process of imagination and thinking and memory turns it into pornography and lust and child abuse and all kinds of things, because you're trying to maximize the pleasure and chasing that pleasure in order to run away from your boredom or something like that. So it becomes a psychological process, and that psychological time is just creation of your own mind. Therefore, it's not part of nature. The animals don't have that. They don't have the capacity for it.
So we have a little bit less than half an hour left, and in a couple of minutes we'll open it up and see if the people here have questions. But let me try to see if we can tie these two topics together. We talked about freedom from the known, and we talked about the ending of time. And I would just like to pose the question, is there a relationship between the two? It seems like in the way that Krishnamurti approaches these issues, he has said, for example, has said that thought is time. Time and thought are one and the same. In fact, at certain places he says it's better to just speak of thought time as a unitary phenomenon rather than two separate things. And he's also talked about thought in terms of knowledge, in terms of the known. He says thought is the response of memory, thought is the past, thought is knowledge. So it seems as though the thought functions as kind of a fulcrum or a point of commonality between freedom from the known and the ending of time. And I wonder if we could just kind of explore or reflect a little bit upon whether or not there's a deep connection between the two topics that we have addressed, the freedom from the known and the ending of time. Are they really perhaps at some deep level even one and the same, or two different facets of a single issue or phenomenon?
I think there are two different facets of the same thing, and that is the entire psychological field. In my experience of reading Krishnamurti, I have found that whenever you find statements like that which are not very clear, you just need to add the word psychological, because he doesn't use that word often. He assumes that we are talking about the psychological area or field. So if you take psychological thought and psychological known, which means the images and the memory of the hurts and past interactions, the pleasures as well as the pains or psychological pains, then those constitute the psychological memory. And psychological known interferes with perception and colors your perception. The factual known does not. The factual known is used if a doctor has to perform an operation for cancer or something. He needs to know exactly what is to be done. He does that. And after that, he is not chewing on it all the time. So, but the psychological known doesn't leave you. It grips you. So it's not so much the known itself as the attachment to the known, the pride in the known, the association of the ego with the known. And that is what I consider that Krishnaji is objecting to. And the ego is, when you do something egoistically, you are creating psychological time, because then you are doing it ambitiously, you are doing it not as a means to an end. The end is psychological, some kind of reputation, prestige, profit, and so on. In other words, you are not doing it for the love of it. The love of it means that there is a joy in the very process of that activity. And you are not energized by the joy in that activity, whatever. Let's take even mathematics. There's great beauty in mathematics. If you do it you will see the beauty in it, or in music, for instance. You will sense the beauty in it, and that beauty is inherent joy in that activity. But when you do it, you need a profit motive in order to do that activity, then you are not doing it, you are doing it egoistically, you are not doing it with love. And one of his statements is, "Sir, come upon love and then do what you will, it will be right." In other words, everything goes wrong only with this ego motive coming into existence. Yeah. Yeah, we can throw it open.
Yes, someone just came in and reminded me there was something else I wanted to say, and that is that later this month, Dr. Krishna and I will be engaging in a whole weekend of dialogue of this kind at the Krishnamurti Educational Center of Canada on Vancouver Island. We're on May 24th, 25th, and 26th. We're going to have a weekend of dialogue exploring topics of this kind. I meant to say that at the beginning, but I forgot, so I'll throw it in there. And now we have 15 or 20 minutes left. Did any questions come? Yeah, Jeff.
So I wonder if we could just use the mic only because we have 50 people watching live. So I wonder if when you talked about the ego, is it something that comes and goes? Because let's say you have somebody who's a salesperson, and their whole life is about making sales and climbing the ladder, making more money, and they're good at it and they feel good about themselves. And then they walk out on the street and somebody slips and falls in front of them and they rush over to help them. At that moment, you could say there's no ego involved. He's not doing it to, So do you think the ego is something that it's here and then it goes and then it comes back and then, or once you're free of it, the way Krishnamurti talks about it, it's like once you're free of it, you're free of it. But that might be my interpretation.
Yes, I think so. That, you see, it's not like an organ in the body, not part of nature. There is no ego anywhere in nature, except in human consciousness. And otherwise, if it was an organ in the body, you would need to operate in order to get it out. It's not like that. It is just comes about in the manner in which you approach it, that the ego enters the activity. So yes, you can do. We all do things where the ego is not involved. For instance, when you just grow a plant in your garden, there is no ego in it. You play with your neighbor's child, there is no ego in it, right? So it's not as if ego is permanently there affecting all your things. But we give importance to our professional activities and those in which there is profit. And therefore there we approach in that egoistic way, ambitious way. And that is where you face those consequences of the ego. And we are not sufficiently aware because we are dazzled by the benefits that come from ego. You do feel as if it protects you. And to some extent it does. But when you see long enough, you will see that that protection is illusory because it is creating all the danger in society from that. Like nationalism appears to be protective because my country and so on, but it is also the cause of war. And war is the cause of maximum amount of destruction in the world. So, if you are doing something because that is right for the whole, then it's not egoistic. But when you are isolating yourself and looking at it only from the what is there in it for me, that's often a question people ask, why should I do this? What is there for me? Like that means you are motivated only by profit incentive. Then you don't know what love is. There is a beautiful passage in Khalil Gibran. in the book The Prophet, where he talks about friendship. And he says, let there be no purpose in friendship save the deepening of the spirit. For love that seeks aught but the disclosure of its own mystery is not love, but a net that is cast forth, and only the unprofitable is caught. So it may seem to you that it's profitable to approach somebody with a motive of receiving something, but the prophet is saying it's not profitable because you will never know what love is if you approach everything in life only from the point of view of what you get for yourself out of it.
Jeff, if I may, I'd like to try to come at the same. It's a very good question. I'd like to come at it from a little different angle. Do egotistical activities, are they something which just kind of comes and goes, or as Krishnamurti sometimes seems to suggest, is it something that can be eradicated at its root entirely? And I would suggest that it may be both possibilities are possible, in the sense that it seems to me that the ego, the self-image, the construct we have of who we are psychologically, it's not just another piece of the furniture of consciousness. Like I have my thought, I have my emotion, I have my desires, I have my motivations, I have my ego, etc., etc. But the ego is like at the foundation of the structure of all of these things. It's the base, it's the ground from which all of these things spring. And because it's so very, very, very deep seated, first of all, we don't notice it very much of the time, because it's like in ordinary life, you don't notice gravity much of the time because it's just so pervasive. You kind of take it for granted. And I think the ego functions somewhat similarly. And so it seems to me there's two possibilities. One is that during the course of my everyday activities, that ground, that foundation of consciousness can act up and enter in, and suddenly something that started off like Krishna was talking about, playing a game. You might start off playing the game just for the sheer sake of playing the game without the competitive spirit. But then once you get into it, something else might come up. You might see somebody that you don't like, and suddenly that competitive spirit, the ego, may enter in, so that it's not just an either-or thing. It's something that you're watching and observing, and it can be changing from moment to moment. And so, somebody may say, well, Krishnamurti said nobody ever understood this thing fully. What's the point? Why bother? And I would say, well, because it is something that you can see in actuality as it functions from moment to moment, and it does make a difference. But at the same time, to penetrate to that really, really deep level, the foundational level where that self-image, that construct is, it seems to like it. Krishnamurti seems to suggest that it's possible to go down to that level and explode that thing and see the illusory nature of that thing and really much more deeply be free from it. And I think that possibly that's what is so elusive, and part of why Krishnamurti has said, nobody really is fully understood.
I think he also made it clear that if you make enlightenment the aim of this inquiry, then this inquiry itself becomes egotistic, because you are seeking to achieve some result called enlightenment, which you are imagining. But if you do it for the love of it, because you want to understand yourself, then it's not egoistic activity. And whatever understanding comes out of your own perceptions, that's the wisdom or the understanding that you have, and it acts, and it will change things in your life. But to imagine that there is an end result to it, It's like saying, I will learn physics only if I can become Einstein. There's enough reason to learn physics just to know how nature functions. And to the extent to which you understand, to that extent you understand how things happen in nature.
It's not imaginary that, like David said, that Krishnamurti talked about exploding this thing, especially about like fear. He always talked about getting to the root of it, not just chopping off a few branches,
Yeah.
but getting to the root of it. And it sounded like if you're not doing that, you're not really getting it. You're not really getting the message. You're not really understanding what he was trying to communicate. That's how I've heard it for 40 years.
Yeah, I agree that nobody fully understood what he was pointing out, but it's not true that nobody understood nothing out of what he did. So that's what I'm saying, that in our experience, I don't know what total freedom is. I have not experienced that. But there has been, for instance, if one has deeply understood that comparing oneself with others is just a disease of the mind, and you free yourself of it by seeing the danger of it, which is not so difficult to understand, well, you are free from feelings of superiority, inferiority, hierarchy, jealousy, envy. Those feelings just drop away from life. That's realizable, and that's enough reason to learn about oneself.
There's another question over here.
Thank you for facilitating the discussion. I would like to further the question that he proposed. So it seems the problem to separate the psychological time and the chronological time, and the fact that ego comes and goes is it's the nature of like the fear that one has in themselves, is like this feeling of insecurity or insufficiency, that the entity that's trying to secure something, when it doesn't feel secure. So with that context, like I see the value of imagination in my life, and like it seems perfectly natural to have imagination, be able to imagine and like be able to do things favorable in order to secure myself and like further or sustain my life. So where to draw the line between how much to imagine and like when to secure and like
Are you saying, when does imagination become illusion? Is that what
exactly,
you're getting at?
yeah. And although it is natural to have imagination, and it's a gift, it's part of who we are. I think the other side of it, and combined with the fact that I do feel insecure, like over the years I have improved my life dramatically, but I still feel insecure. So where do I stop securing myself and completely feel secure psychologically? So how to draw the line is the, it seems to be the problem that
So,
we have
so
an
there's,
answer.
there's an objective element to security, as well as a place where it spills over into illusion and something else. Is that what you're getting at, partly?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
That is what self-knowledge is about, that you cannot get this line from some book, or it's not like engineering drawing that you can make a drawing and say, beyond this we will not grow grass or something like that. And it comes in almost everything. When does need turn into greed? When does a wish turn into a desire? And when does it start creating problems, and when is it quite innocent? Because wishes don't create any problem, no? I wish to go for a walk. I wish to have this dialogue. If I had fallen ill and couldn't come, it would not create any great frustration. So the ego is not attached to it. But suppose in this very discussion, the motive was to impress all of you and so on, then I would lose that opportunity and I would feel sorry about it. So your motive determines the way you approach things. And that is what you have to watch. And so that is not something you can learn from a book or from a guru. Krishnamurti is saying by watching yourself, he called it the art of living. Art is not something you can learn from a book. You will have to play with it and find out, and your senses will tell you. So you stay with the question and you find out, and you will yourself learn where that line is. Nobody else can draw that line for you. Yeah. So that's why this kind of learning about oneself, unfortunately, it's not encouraged in our education. Our education draws our attention only to the outer world, understanding the outer world. We spend a lot of time how the sun gets its energy from and so on. But in our own life, about our relationship, about how to bring up children, what is the right diet, what is the right exercise to take, and so on. Education does not concern itself with that normally. In a Krishnamurti school it does, but normally. So that's why he wanted to change education, because he felt this is necessary for a human being to understand himself. So his approach to education was that demand excellence in academics, at the same time demand excellence in understanding oneself and in relationship, in all relationship. And there is excellence only when there is no conflict in relationship. Every time there is conflict, it's an opportunity to learn that somewhere I am not approaching this rightly. And you have to find out for yourself where it is and correct it. Because it's coming from your own approach, which is illusory somewhere.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say this, something quite similar in slightly different words. You know, where does imagination become illusion, right? Where does the objective need for security become the psychological? Where does need become greed? And I think it's correct to say that, you know, Krishnamurti often said, well, there's no method. You know, you can't systematize this, because if you make a system out of it, it's just a mechanical thing. And the method will dictate the result. But that doesn't mean you just throw up your hands and there's nothing you can do. There's an art to this. That's why I think Krishna was quite right to use the word art. It's an art to observe these things factually as they are happening in daily life. And that makes learning a living thing. You're not just acquiring a strategy that you can memorize, but you're observing from moment to moment. Are there more questions?
Yeah.
Oh, you're saying we have 5 minutes left. Okay,
Dr.
5 minutes left. Yes,
Yeah,
one
Dr.
more
Krishna,
question.
it's very interesting to go through your lectures. I met Krishnamurti several times in my career. It was motivated, and my question is, earlier you referred about end justifies means, or
No,
right,
ends don't justify
right?
the means.
There are two things like a Machiavelli says, end justifies means. That is a 15th century philosopher. If
Machiavelli.
you want to win a war, end justifies means. That is by
Machiavelli said that, is
Yeah,
what
Machiavelli
you're saying.
said in
Yeah.
15th century.
That's
Entire
what Bush,
mankind followed with that
that's what
approach.
Mr. Bush said,
Yeah.
that he was
That is-
trying to remove dictatorship from Iraq and bring in democracy.
And I have two-part
But
question.
million people died in that process, and that was just collateral damage.
I have
Because
two-
the intention was to bring democracy to that country.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah, so the path to hell is paved with a lot of good intentions.
Mine is a two-part question. First one is, does end justifies means, or does rightful means always justify something good?
The means
Like-
are the end. The means are the end. Through violence, what you call peace is not achieved. it seemingly achieved because the other person is suppressed. But it'll produce so much hatred that that will be the cause of the next war. So if you see far enough, you see that there is this other saying that happiness is not at the end of the road, it is along the way. So the moment you posit it somewhere at the end and to achieve it, it goes wrong.
But if means are good, does it take to your right end?
The means are the...
assumption like, for example, if I need to go to a good school, do you get a good result? Or school doesn't matter, my end is to go to Harvard. Does end justifies my means, or rightful means always take to me to your right justification?
You see, your question, does rightful means inevitably bring about a good result? The very question presupposes the problem, because even if you put it that way, you're separating the means from the end.
Yeah.
And I think what Krishna is trying to say is that you need to think of means and ends as a unit, as an inseparable, like a system, okay? That you can distinguish between means and ends analytically, but in life, in actuality, they are inherently linked, inseparable.
Thank you.
So I think that we are down to pretty much our last minute. Okay,
One more
time for
question,
one more
yeah.
question.
Sure.
Yes, my question is, in the first presentation, the presenter played several video clips, and in one of the video clips, there was a lady who said that the limitation that Krishna ji taught her, that the limitation of thought was a tool that led to an action, and that this action was an expression of what Krishnamurti called human mutation.
Called what? Human mutation?
Yes, mutation. He calls it a mutation. In some of he was talking about that in the Grove too. So my question is, can you speak to that?
Yes, I mean, I was there in that, I listened to that clip this morning. If you are referring to the clip of Padma Madolkar, she mentioned that the Buddha brought rationality into spirituality. And Krishnamurti went a step further and pointed to the limits of rationality or limits of thought, like that. That's what she said, but I don't think that from my knowledge of Buddhist, having talked to Buddhist scholars, that's not a completely correct picture of the Buddha, because he stressed on mindfulness, and that is just another word for awareness. So passive awareness and is very closely related to mindfulness, which is what the Dalai Lama talks about. So I'm not sure that she had a correct understanding of the Buddha's teaching. But if you take it that way, that he was bringing in rationality, I mean, you could accuse Krishnamurti of that too, because he was trying to communicate something that is not communicable, but he's using a logical process in explaining it. Now, as far as communication goes, logic is helpful, but it can't answer the problem. It can communicate, explain things, but explanation does not change the thing at the ground. You can, I mean, philosophers have all the explanations as to why we feel fear or why we have division, all this, but they themselves are not free from all that. So what is special about Buddha is that he was not just a professor of Buddhism, right? That he actually came upon a consciousness. He came upon a consciousness which was free from sorrow and psychological suffering and so on, and then talked to people. And the same about Jesus Christ. The professor of Christian theology is not Jesus Christ. What is the difference? They have the words, but they don't have the spirit behind it, right? So Krishnamurti is talking about how do you go from the knowledge of the truth to the perception of the truth. And that is the pathless bit. Knowledge, there is a path to it. You can join a philosophy department in a university and they'll tell you everything about Christ, about Buddha, about Socrates. They study it, they take exams on it. But they are ambitious, they are greedy, they are selfish, they have all those problems. So knowledge doesn't take you there. Which doesn't mean the knowledge is wrong. It doesn't take you there.
Okay, so then we have really and truly come to the ending of time. It's a fact, not just an illusion. So
Yeah.
thank you all so much for coming.